cabin stood nestled in the heart of the mountains, its weathered logs a testament to years gone by. I had heard the stories, the whispers of a curse that had befallen the family who once called it home. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a sense of unease that lingered in the air like a thick fog. Despite the warnings, I couldn't resist the lure of the cabin. As a writer with a fascination for the macabre, I saw it as an opportunity to uncover the truth behind the legends. Armed with a notebook and a flashlight, I set out to spend the night in the cursed cabin. The journey to the mountains was treacherous, the winding roads shrouded in darkness. The air grew colder with each mile, and a sense of foreboding settled over me like a heavy cloak. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it loomed before me like a specter from a nightmare. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of decay. The cabin was small, with a single room and a loft overhead. The furniture was old and worn, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clear that no one had lived here in years. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the forest outside grew silent. I sat in the dim light of a lantern, listening for any sign of the supernatural. Hours passed, but nothing happened. I began to doubt the stories, wondering if I had been foolish to believe in such nonsense. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard it. The faint sound of silverware clinking against plates. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening intently. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the murmur of voices, a family at dinner. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured into the darkness, following the sound to the back of the cabin. There, in the corner of the room, I saw them. The ghostly figures of a family, seated at an invisible table. They were indistinct, their features blurred and ephemeral, but I could sense the weight of their presence. I watched in awe as they went about their meal, their movements slow and deliberate. It was as if they were trapped in a loop, doomed to repeat the same actions for eternity. I tried to speak to them, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and I knew that something was watching me from the shadows. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I had to leave, had to get out of the cabin before it was too late. But as I turned to go, I felt a hand on my shoulder. A cold, clammy hand that sent shivers down my spine. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the figure standing before me. It was the ghostly apparition of a woman, her eyes empty and soulless. She reached out to me, her fingers curling into claws. "Leave this place," she hissed, her voice a whisper that echoed through the cabin. "You do not belong here." I tried to run, but her grip was like iron. I struggled against her, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, suddenly, she released me, and I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I heard a voice that seemed to come from within the very walls of the cabin. It was the voice of the patriarch, the man who had once called this place home. "Begone," he said, his voice filled with anger and sorrow. "This cabin is cursed, and all who enter here are doomed to share our fate." With that, the cabin seemed to tremble, its walls groaning with the weight of centuries of sorrow. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of the family's dinner fading behind me. As I stumbled out into the darkness, I knew that I would never forget my night in the cursed cabin. It was a night filled with terror and despair, a night that would haunt me for the rest of my days. And though I escaped with my life, I knew that the curse would always linger, waiting for its next victim to stray too close. A Wilshire theater had been closed for over 70 years, ever since the tragic fire that claimed the lives of the performers and audience during its last performance. The fire had started mysteriously, spreading with unnatural speed and trapping everyone inside. Over the years, the theater had become a hotspot for paranormal activity, drawing ghost hunters and thrill seekers from far and wide. As a writer with a penchant for horror, I decided to spend a night there, seeking to uncover the truth behind the haunting. I arrived at the theater just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the decaying facade. The once grand building now stood in ruins, its ornate architecture marred by soot and time. The iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped onto the overgrown pathway leading to the entrance. Inside, the theater was a ghost of its former self. The grand chandelier lay in pieces on the floor, and the velvet seats were covered in a thick layer of dust. The smell of charred wood and mildew filled the air. I set up my equipment in the main auditorium, positioning cameras and audio recorders to capture any paranormal activity. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and the silence became oppressive. I sat in the front row, the burnt remains of the stage looming before me. The ghost hunters had reported hearing applause, music, and seeing ghostly figures. But the most chilling accounts were of the ballerina who died in the fire. They said she danced in the aisles, her form flickering like a candle's flame. I waited for hours, my senses on high alert. Just as I was beginning to doubt anything would happen, I heard it, the faint sound of music, as if a distant orchestra was tuning up. I grabbed my recorder and began documenting everything. The music grew louder, filling the empty theater with an eerie melody. Then, I saw her. The ballerina appeared in the aisle to my right, her delicate form flickering like a flame. She was dressed in a tattered tutu, her once beautiful costume now charred and torn. Her movements were graceful, yet sorrowful, as if she were reliving her final performance. I watched, transfixed, as she danced closer, her eyes hollow and devoid of life. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She continued to dance, her feet barely touching the ground. As she passed by me, I felt a cold breeze, and a wave of despair washed over me. I followed her with my eyes, documenting her every move. She danced to the center of the stage, where she paused and turned to face me. "Why are you here?" I asked, louder this time. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition. Then, she vanished, the music abruptly stopping. The silence that followed was deafening. I replayed the footage on my camera, hoping to find some clue, but she had disappeared without a trace. Determined to uncover the truth, I explored the theater further, guided by the faint echoes of the past. In the dressing rooms, I found old photographs and playbills, remnants of the theater's glory days. One photograph caught my eye, a young ballerina smiling brightly, her eyes full of life. It was the same ballerina I had seen, before the fire had taken everything from her. I continued my search, delving deeper into the theater's history. In the archives, I discovered a newspaper article about the fire. It mentioned a man, Arthur Blackwood, who had been infatuated with the ballerina. He had been seen arguing with her the night of the fire, and some believed he had started the blaze out of jealousy. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The pieces were coming together, but I needed more. As I made my way back to the auditorium, the music started again, Louder this time. The ballerina appeared once more, but this time she was not alone. Ghostly figures filled the seats, their faces blurred and indistinct. They were the lost souls of the audience, forever trapped in the theater. The ballerina danced, her movements frantic and desperate. She seemed to be trying to tell me something. I focused my camera on her, hoping to capture any clues. As she danced, I noticed a shadowy figure lurking in the wings of the stage. It was a man, his face twisted in a malevolent grin. Arthur Blackwood. "Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty theater. The shadowy figure stepped forward, his presence filling the room with a suffocating darkness. The ballerina's dance became more frantic, as if she were trying to warn me. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick with tension. "You caused this," I said, my voice trembling. "You trapped them here." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "They belong to me," he said, his voice echoing from the shadows. "They will never leave." I felt a surge of anger. "No, they don't," I shouted. "I will free them." With that, the ballerina stopped dancing and looked directly at me. Her eyes, once hollow, now seemed to plead for help. I knew what I had to do. I pulled out a small vial of holy water and a crucifix, hoping it would be enough to break the curse. I stepped onto the stage, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadowy figure recoiled, hissing in anger. The ballerina moved beside me, her form flickering more intensely. I sprinkled the holy water around the stage, reciting a prayer for the trapped souls. As the last drop of water hit the floor, a blinding light filled the theater. The ghostly figures in the seats began to fade, their tormented expressions softening. The shadowy figure let out a furious scream, then vanished into the darkness. The ballerina looked at me, a tear slipping down her cheek, before she too faded into the light. The theater fell silent once more, but this time the silence was peaceful. I knew the spirits had finally found rest. I gathered my equipment and left the Wilshire Theater, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. I wrote the story of the ghostly theater, detailing the tragedy, the haunting, and the final release of the trapped souls. It became one of my most popular works, but more importantly, it brought closure to a dark chapter in the theater's history. To this day, the Wilshire Theater stands as a reminder of the past, but it is no longer a place of fear. The spirits have moved on, and the ballerina can finally rest, her eternal dance complete. The lighthouse stood alone on the cliff's edge, battered by the relentless winds and the crashing waves below. It had been abandoned for decades, but tales of its ghostly keeper and inexplicable phenomena had persisted through the years. As a journalist specializing in the paranormal, I couldn't resist the lure of such a notorious location. With a mix of excitement and dread, I set off to uncover the secrets of the Phantom Lighthouse. The journey to the cliff was treacherous. The narrow, winding road was barely visible through the dense fog that seemed to cling to the landscape like a shroud. I parked my car at the end of the road and continued on foot, the sound of the ocean growing louder with each step. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. As I approached, I could feel an oppressive weight in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the memories of the past. The lighthouse was in a state of disrepair, its paint peeling and windows broken. The door, surprisingly, was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the musty scent of damp wood and decay assaulting my senses. The interior was dimly lit by the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. The walls were lined with old photographs and newspaper clippings, telling the story of the lighthouse and its ill-fated keepers. Each one had met a tragic end. Accidents, disappearances, unexplained deaths. The most recent clipping, dated 50 years ago, detailed the mysterious death of the last keeper, Samuel Green, found at the top of the lighthouse with no visible wounds, but an expression of sheer terror frozen on his face. Determined to spend the night and document any paranormal activity, I set up my equipment in the main room. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the floor, I made my way up the spiral staircase to the lantern room. Each step echoed through the empty structure, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The lantern room was a stark contrast to the rest of the lighthouse. It was meticulously clean, with the brass fittings polished and the glass panes free of dust. It was as if someone still tended to it, despite the abandonment. As I stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine. The light, long extinguished, flickered to life, casting a ghostly glow across the room. I reached for my camera, but as soon as I did, the light went out, plunging the room back into darkness. I hurried back downstairs, heart pounding. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see someone there, but the staircase was empty. I set up my camera to record the stairwell, hoping to capture whatever was causing the noise. Hours passed, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant crash of waves. Just as I was about to pack up, a low, mournful sound pierced the silence. It was the foghorn, blaring in the clear night. I ran outside, looking up at the lighthouse. The light was on again, and through the glass, I saw a figure moving. The ghostly keeper, Samuel Green. With trembling hands, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back inside. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, each step a struggle against an unseen force. As I reached the top, the light went out again, and the room was filled with an icy cold. The figure of Samuel Green stood before me, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm here to find out what happened to you," I replied, my voice shaking. He stared at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of humanity in his eyes. "I never left," he said. "I am bound to this place, doomed to tend the light for eternity." "How can I help you?" I asked, desperate to break the cycle of his torment. He looked at me, his expression softening. "Find the truth," he said. "The truth will set us free." Before I could ask anything else, he vanished, and the room warmed slightly. Determined to uncover the truth, I spent the next several hours searching the lighthouse. In a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, I found an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The journal belonged to Samuel Green. It detailed his time at the lighthouse, the strange occurrences, and his growing fear. The final entry was the most chilling. He spoke of a shadowy figure that appeared each night, growing closer and more menacing. He feared for his life, but felt compelled to keep the light burning. As I read the last words, a realization hit me. Samuel Green had been murdered, not by a person, but by the malevolent spirit of a previous keeper, one who had also met a tragic end. This vengeful spirit had trapped him, just as it had trapped others before him. Armed with this knowledge, I knew what I had to do. I climbed back to the lantern room and recited the names of the keepers who had died there, acknowledging their suffering and promising to tell their stories. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I felt a presence surround me. A voice, not Samuel's, but older, darker, whispered in my ear, "You cannot free us. We are bound by the light, by the curse of this place." "I will tell your story," I said, my voice steady. I will make sure the world knows what happened here." There was a moment of silence, and then gradually, the oppressive weight lifted. The light in the lantern room flickered once more, and then went out for good. The foghorn, which had been blaring intermittently, fell silent. I left the lighthouse as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing the fog. The air felt lighter, as if the spirits of the keepers had finally found peace. True to my word, I wrote their story, detailing the tragedies and the curse that had bound them to the lighthouse. The phantom lighthouse still stands, a silent sentinel on the cliff's edge, but now its story is known, and the spirits of its keepers are at rest. I often wonder if, somewhere in the afterlife, Samuel Green and the others found the peace they were denied in life. One thing is certain: I will never forget my night in the Phantom Lighthouse, and the souls who, for a time, shared their eternal vigil with me.